I know that the goal is to like put out as much stupid shit as possible. The first thing that you brought up, the idea that like, so a common tactic is to say like weasel words, like, well, blacks commit way more crime than whites, and then whites don't commit as much crime as like, instead of actually like looking at the actual figures. So, for instance, if we were to say that like there is a good reason for black people to be pulled over more than white people, then you would expect to see that those pullovers are actually like accomplishing the goal of like finding more crime. This just doesn't seem to be the case though. So, for instance, an analysis of 4.5 million traffic stops in North Carolina shows that black and Latino drivers are more likely to be searched than whites, okay, given the population. However, despite that, there are still more profitable searches turning up white motorists having contraband. And then this study has been repeated in Nashville as well, where even if you look at the amount of stops, even if you look at the fact that, well, they commit more crime, whatever the fuck that means, when you actually analyze, like, well, how likely are they to turn up contraband or to catch somebody for a crime, they actually aren't being able to justify these stops with these numbers. It's one of the reasons why stop and frisk has been phased out so largely in New York. It's just not good policing. Even if we throw all the social justice, whatever aside, and all the feel good or whatever, if we just look at the raw data, stop and frisk is just not a good way to catch crime.
So this is how you bullshit your way through a debate, basically. I decided to look up some of the studies that Destiny talks about in this, and I decided I would go through them. I really find this very interesting. It's a very technical study. This comes from Stanford University. It's a very accredited university, right? Very high class. Now, I'm not going to go into the people behind this. You can do that if you want, but anyway. So this is a new way for them to study crime statistics, and it's very interesting. So they don't really slam, but they give light criticism of the two previous ways of doing this, the benchmark and outcome test. And the outcome test is basically how we measure racial crime statistics today. But they say, well, it can obfuscate discrimination and it can indicate discrimination where none exists. Whatever, we'll leave that alone. But just looking at this, so what I wanted to point out here was this is the methodology they use. So there are 287. Oh, by the way, I should define the threshold test. The threshold test is a new thing that they have. This is a way that they claim that they can evaluate the motivations of a police officer by ascribing a certain mathematical value to whatever factors may influence his decision to be suspicious of a suspect. So they'll assign a certain value to nervousness, to other things that might constitute probable cause. And through doing that, they say, well, we can isolate racial bias through process of elimination by discerning, well, are you more suspicious of black people, or does nervousness play a greater part in in interactions between minorities and police officers? So here's what they're saying. There are 287 police departments in our data set, including city departments, departments on college campuses, sheriff's offices, and the North Carolina State Patrol. We find that the State Patrol officers conduct 47% of stops, but carry out only 12% of all searches, and recover only 6% of all contraband found. State Patrol officers search vastly less often than other officers, and the relatively few searches they do carry out are less successful. Given these qualitative differences, we exclude State Patrol searches from our primary analysis. So in other words, nearly 50% of all searches, or all stops, 47% of all stops in the entire state of North Carolina are not covered in this assessment at all. That is very relevant. They're trying to minimize it. They're trying to make it sound like, oh, we left these out because they're irrelevant. That's not true. That's an obfuscation, and I'm going to come back to that. But I also want to take issue with the fact that they say, well, it's not less relevant because they're not really confiscating anything. Well, look at this. 12% of all searches, but they're recovering 6% of all contraband found. So yes, the majority of their stops, they don't have probable cause to search the vehicle. Now, why that is, probably because, drug traffickers and weapons traffickers are going to be very sophisticated about, how they hide their contraband. They're not going to let you search the vehicle, and they're certainly not going to give you reason to search the vehicle. They're not going to be driving around high. They're not going to have, they're not going to have minor traffic infractions or something like that. No. In fact, I may not have saved that tab. There's a tab that said like 50%, nearly 50% of all drug traffickers in the country were people with either little or no criminal history, no criminal past. So, essentially the idea that you can even use a person's rap sheet to evaluate whether or not you're going to find contraband in their vehicle is very questionable, to say the least. But 6% of all contraband is found in 12% of searches. That suggests that roughly, and again, this isn't accurate, but roughly 50% of these searches that these state troopers are doing are getting hits, right? I mean, I'm not wrong about that math, am I? And that 50% is actually less than the 30% that the local and city departments are doing. So actually, these searches are more effective on average than the ones that you're measuring, but you're trying to minimize them for some reason. We continue. We further restrict to the 100 largest local police departments by number of recorded stops, which in aggregate comprise 91% of all non-state patrol stops. We are left with 4.5 million stops. That's the number that Destiny was citing, that we use for our primary analysis. Among the set of stops, 50% of drivers are white, 40% are black, 8.5% are Hispanic, and 1.5% are Asian. The overall search rate is 4.1%. And the 29% of searches turn up contraband. So 30% of all searches turn up contraband. Now, this is very interesting. I believe the Hispanic population, according to the U.S. Census of North Carolina, is only 4.7%, but they're 8.5% of people being stopped. That's relevant because when we look up, let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, when we look up the statistics for this, oh yes, here it is. Sorry, 49.5% of busted drug traffickers in 2013 had no prior criminal history, little or no prior criminal history. The majority of drug trafficking offenders arrested in 2013 were Hispanic at 47.9%, while 26.7% were black and 22.3% were white. So now what's interesting about that is that blacks are actually not, horribly overrepresented in this. Now I know drug trafficking is not that's not the only contraband that you can get, but it's the primary one, right? That's why I'm focusing on this, because that's mostly where contraband confiscation is going to come from, is mostly drugs, right? So when we're talking about this, like, it makes sense. Blacks are overrepresented in this. I believe the black population in, let's see if I have it here. I may not have. I might have closed that. Sorry. Well, actually, I think the black population of North Carolina is something around 27%. But nevertheless, this is an overrepresentation nationally of 50%, or rather 100%. I guess it's double. It's the 13% of the population, 26% of drug smugglers. But you have to remember that when it comes to other crimes like rape and murder, we're talking about factors of 500% or more. So they're actually not as overrepresented in terms of drug trafficking compared to other crimes. So when it comes to contraband, we would expect that the arrest rate for blacks would be lower than for other crimes. So this is specifically a crime for which blacks are primarily innocent, or at least disproportionately innocent compared to the other crimes that they commit. However, Hispanics have a much higher rate of doing this sort of stuff. They have a much higher, I mean, this makes sense. Everyone knows this, right? Everyone knows that Hispanics have a higher rate for these sorts of things. However, I just wanted to point this out. North Carolina has a terrible problem with drug trafficking through the state. Not necessarily into the state. Into it is, yeah, that is a problem as well. They talk about how there are meth labs in the mountains and things like this. It's interesting that they talk about crimes that are typically associated with white people in this consensus. But what I found interesting, this is on justice.gov, as you can see. Some people who came to North Carolina for employment were migrant workers, some of whom were recruited as drug carriers or were members of criminal groups involved in illicit drug transportation and distribution. So they're either criminals when they got there, or they were recruited to criminal organizations. I mean, this is something the Justice Department fucking notes. But this is what's interesting. So you have to understand what North Carolina is as a state. North Carolina's vast stretches of rural terrain, particularly in the west, provide opportunities for criminal groups to conceal drug-related activities. Reporting from law enforcement officials indicates that methamphetamine production laboratories frequently are located in the mountains and woods of western and central North Carolina, and cannabis cultivations are widespread in areas including the Pisgah and Nantahala National Forests in the western part of the state. Most drugs are transported into and through North Carolina via private and commercial vehicles. Criminal groups commonly use interstate highways to transport drugs into the state for distribution in local communities and through the state to destinations in other states. Interstate 95 extends from Miami through North Carolina to the U.S.-Canada border in Maine. Interstate 40 extends from Wilmington to the southeastern corner of North Carolina to California. And again, we know California has a lot of drugs, and I can tell you, I'm familiar with Maine. Maine has one of the primary, or several of the primary choke points for drugs to be smuggled into Canada. So this is a very busy highway. Interstate 85 branches off I-95 to Virginia, connects to, and I don't know how to pronounce this town, Raleigh, Durham. I know that's the capital of North Carolina. I just don't know how to pronounce it. Greensboro and Charlotte with Atlanta, Georgia, and ends at I-65 in Montgomery, Alabama. Interstate 77 runs from Cleveland, Ohio, which, by the way, Ohio seems to have one of the top three states. I believe it's North Carolina, Florida, and Ohio have the top three highest rates for traffic stops. So this is another a state that's responsible for this. I almost called it a province. Through Charlotte to South Carolina. Half of the 56, this is key, half of the 56 drug or currency seizures reported by Operation Pipeline in North Carolina in 2000 occurred on I-95. So this is an issue. This is a problem. We're talking about drugs being trafficked through the state, and you're excluding all state patrol stops because you say, well, it's negligible. It's negligible, but most of the contraband that's being trafficked through the state is not going through these major cities. It's going through the highways. So, and despite the fact that that's why they're committing all of these stops. That's why you get 47% of stops are carried out by these state patrol officers, but only 12% of them are searches. Well, because they're trying to stop this, they're trying to catch these fucking people, but if you don't have legal grounds to search a vehicle, then you can't do it. So that's the reality of the situation. This is not being factored into your statistics at all. Not at all. You explicitly say we're not including 47% of these stops when these stops are the most relevant to contraband confiscation. So I don't understand. I do understand. I know why you're doing this, but it's disingenuous. It sabotages the whole fucking study, doesn't it? I mean, because this is going to affect how officers in the city behave. If officers in the city understand that their state is a massive hub for drug trafficking and other contraband being trafficked through the state, then they're going to act accordingly. And yes, it may turn out that they don't get the sort of arrests that you were expecting, that you want, and maybe you try to use that as justification, say, "Oh, this is racism. It's just because they have this prejudice against Hispanics." Well, maybe that prejudice is based on the fact that Hispanics in their state have a history of working for illegal organizations, for drug cartels. They have a history of trafficking drugs through the state, and this history, the main route through which they do this, is being intentionally excluded by your study. So this is the problem. This is what Destiny is citing. This fucking study, and you can go through it if you want. It's very dense. I don't like the technical. I'm not a mathematician. I'm sorry. I'm not a big brain intellectual like some people are. But I did trudge through this. It's fucking absurd. It's absurd. But this is the rate. So yeah, we start with a standard benchmark and outcome analysis of North Carolina stops. Table 1 shows that the search rate for black drivers, 5.4%, and the Hispanic drivers, 4.1%, is higher than for white drivers, 3.1%. Moreover, when searched, the rate of recovering contraband on blacks, 29%, and Hispanics, 19%, is lower than when searching whites, 32%. Thus, both the benchmark and outcome tests point to discrimination in search decisions against blacks and Hispanics. The evidence for this discrimination against Asians is mixed. Asian drivers are searched less often than whites. So, now the interesting thing about this is, these are this isn't talking again. This is excluding the rural stops, and also, like, I would expect that if this is a through way for most of the drugs, if most of the drugs are not stopping in North Carolina but going to other places, I would expect that when you are stopping and searching the locals, you're not going to have this the hit rate that you might expect, or the hit rate that might justify the searches and the stops. Like I kind of, when you understand the history of this and the circumstances behind it, it makes sense why they're doing this, but your little threshold table doesn't take into account the circumstances of the state. That it only takes into account the circumstances of the individual encounters, and even that is questionable. I don't necessarily agree with your evaluation on all of that, but here's another interesting point about this study. If I could find it real quick here. Yeah, this is it here. We examined the specific case of Raleigh Police Department, the second largest department in North Carolina, by number of stops recorded in our database. Black drivers in Raleigh are searched at a higher rate than whites, 4.4% versus 2%, but when searched, blacks are also found to have contraband at a higher rate, 16% versus 13%. The benchmark and outcome test thus yield conflicting assessments of whether black drivers face discrimination. Figure 6 shows the inferred signal distributions and thresholds for whites and black drivers in Raleigh, and sheds light on these seemingly contradictory results. The signal distribution, by the way, that's the number of influences. That's the probability that the officer is evaluating. So your nervousness, past infractions, things that will impact whether or not he searches your vehicle. That's the signal distribution. It's the signals you're giving to the police officer. For black drivers, has a heavier right tail. For example, there is 4 times more mass above 20% than in the white distribution. This suggests that officers can more easily determine which black drivers are carrying contraband, which causes their searches of drivers to be more successful than their searches of white drivers. In spite of the higher hit rate for the black drivers, we find that the blacks still face a lower search threshold than whites, suggesting discrimination against blacks. So again, this threshold is being used as a justification in the face of the fact that, like, black people just fucking carry drugs out in the open. Like, when the officers pull them over, they just see the drugs, and they're using that as like, oh no, well no, but the search threshold is still lower. It still takes less evidence. So don't be fooled by that. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. No, it's still racism against blacks. That's literally what they're doing right now. It's fucking garbage. And this is the really shitty thing about this, because when James Alsop says, well, what about warrants? He pointed out one of these concerns. He's like, well, what about the warrants? Because if you're stopped and it turns out you have a warrant out for your arrest, then they have to search your vehicle. Is that going to be counted among the statistics? And he's like, well, if you're leaving that out, that's going to be a major factor. And Destiny's response was, well, prove to me that it would be a major factor. No, motherfucker, we don't have to prove that the factors you omitted, the relevant factors omitted in your data, would have a consequence. We don't have to prove that. You have to prove the opposite. You have to prove that the factors you omitted have zero consequence, because otherwise I can just throw out your whole fucking study. And also, this is a study on one state that has a very peculiar relationship with the type of criminality that you're evaluating. And then, as I've gone over, the data contained within this study is questionable. I would say I would question it. I question it. I question Stanford University. I know I'm a midwit. I know I'm not a big brain intellectual like you, Destiny, but I question their motivations. I also question your other example, which was Nashville, Tennessee. Because Destiny talked about Nashville when he was talking about broken window policing and stop and frisk. Okay, so this is an article about this whole controversy. He's talking about how these studies have been replicated in Tennessee. Okay, well, let's look at these replications, shall we? So essentially it's saying traffic stops don't reduce crime. This is a story which supports his position. Traffic stops don't reduce crime, researchers found. It's really quite stark. Leaders of the policing project released the findings to the Metro Council's Public Safety Committee on Monday afternoon. There was absolutely no relationship. Barry Friedman, director of the policing project and a former professor at Vanderbilt University School of Law, told the council, referring to traffic stops and crime in Nashville. It's really quite stark. The policing project, part of the New York University School of Law, has conducted similar reports of other cities. Former Mayor Megan Barry's administration tapped the group to study Nashville after a 2017 report from the nonprofit Gideon's Army indicated racial disparities in traffic stops. So essentially what they're saying here is like there's no correlation. I think you get it. There's no correlation between the traffic stops and a reduced crime rate. So the disparities are even higher for non-moving violations, things such as broken taillights, broken headlights, and expired tags, than for moving violations. Okay, last year, black drivers in Nashville were 68% more likely to be stopped for a non-moving violation than white drivers. Now, what's interesting about that, I mean, we have examples that might outline why this is. Philando Castile, as you might remember, when he was brutally killed for no reason whatsoever by that police officer, he had more than 50 minor traffic violations. So, and he was being stopped for a broken taillight. So, I mean, these people don't seem to fucking learn. I don't know. Was he paying those fines? I don't think so. I highly doubt he was paying 50 fines. But no, he just kept ignoring them. Like, how that guy wasn't put in jail for just like evading fines, I don't know. Because there's no way you paid 50 traffic violations and like you still never learned to like fix your brake light. There's no way, right? But anyway, you get the idea. Like this disparity doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the fact that black people don't replace their fucking brake lights. Apparently, I don't know. But only 21 out of every 1,000 non-moving violation stops, just over 2%, resulted in an arrest or recovery of drugs or contraband. So I mean that's pretty minuscule, and that's across racial lines. Yeah. So the claim being made here is that the reason why there's no correlation here. They'll say, well, a week-by-week basis, yes, non-moving violation stops do not appear to have a discernible effect on either long-term or short-term crime rates, as they result in a relatively small number of arrests. Okay, well, that fine, but the problem here is you're claiming that this doesn't have any effect because I don't think I have the article right up right now. I did have an article, but you can, if you don't trust me, please fact check me on this. The claim is by Barry Friedman and his police institute, his little non-judiciary policing project. The idea is because the crime statistics plateaued in 2012 at the peak of these stops, essentially. So the highest number was, I believe, 458,000 in 2012. Then the crime rate plateaued. So therefore, that proves that this has no effect. However, I can't find the statistics before 2012. I can't find the statistics leading up to 2012. But the police chief claims that they have been doing this for years. So here are the stats. Here are the stats from 2002 to 2016. If the numbers, yeah, it does kind of plateau around 2012, but you can see that the numbers were going up from 2002 to 2005, and then they start precipitously declining as these stops increase. And then around 2012, there's a bit of a valley right here, but around 2012, it sort of plateaued out. It dipped and then it came back up again. But again, this is not proof of anything. This isn't proof that there was no long-term effect. In fact, it's proof of exactly the opposite, because if they've been doing this for years, and if it had been increasing over the years to the point where it plateaus in 2012, and then the crime rate plateaus with it, then that seems to prove a correlation, doesn't it? I mean, I don't get how you're coming to the conclusion that something that continued for years following a precipitous decline in crime, and then it's plateauing around the time that the crime rate plateaus. How does that disprove the effects of this policy? That doesn't make sense. And also, this is the Tennessee traffic fatalities. This is almost exactly the same fucking graph. Look at this. It's the same fucking graph. So what's causing this? Destiny will say, well, you have to prove that it was stop and frisk that resulted in the drop in crime in New York City and not some other factor. Okay, well, what factor? I mean, I can't prove to you that it was this policy, but I'd like to know what other policy would cause the crime rate in Nashville, Tennessee to drop in correlation with the traffic fatalities at the same time. What other thing would account for causing both of these graphs to be identical What could you possibly provide to me? I mean, maybe there are other factors, maybe there are other policies, but you know what? I think I have good enough data to suggest that this is the case. Now, I don't have a study. I'm sorry, I don't have a comprehensive academic study to prove this to you. But you know, I'm not a fucking retard, so I can look at numbers and figure out what the cause is when you have overlapping statistics between things that are generally not related. You know, crime and fatal. I mean, fatal crashes are typically caused by things like alcohol and drugs. You know, but if we're talking about criminality, if we're talking about rape and murder and violence, in addition to those things, in addition to drunk driving and driving under the influence of a substance, then like yeah, I'm gonna say that this had a very large impact, and I think the police chief is absolutely correct to call into question their shitty methodologies. And if you look into this organization, the Policing Project, yeah, the Policing Project is dedicated to strengthening policing through democratic governance. Democratic governance. Policing agencies play a vital role in ensuring a safe and secure society to see that they function effectively. Oh yeah, we're for the cops, guys. We're for the cops. Now you find names like Barry Friedman and Mark Cohen, you know, all through this organization. This is a Jewish organization. Let's get fucking real, okay? It is a think tank. It is a Jewish think tank. 1 to 10 employees. 1 to 10 employees, and these people are having this kind of impact. How do you think this is happening? Go to their website. Go to their website. They just got a fucking another grant. Their funding has been increased. So this tiny little group of people, of individuals, playing this massive role in the policing of Nashville, are using erroneous methodology to try to claim that no, this actually has no effect. And I'm not going to autistically pan through their fucking data because I know it's bullshit. But yeah, no, this is the kind of garbage that Destiny is citing. This is the sort of trash that he's talking about. And I'm not, yeah, this is why, like, if you're talking about the academic structure in a capitalist neoliberal system, you're going to have studies and information that supports those positions, regardless of the truth. This is why I don't want your studies. I don't want your academic bullshit. I would prefer to have the raw numbers and to be able to come to the conclusions myself, because I'm not a fucking drone. Like all of you people who think that Destiny is a smart guy. All you people that think that he's like a brilliant dude. Oh my god, he's so smart. He just BTFO'd the Nazis. No, he's a fucking liar. Destiny and Vosh are fucking liars. And that's what you people need to get through your fucking heads. I'm sorry, but this is just the fucking reality of it. Like, no, this is bullshit. Anyway, thank you and good night.